In this video, I want to bring together a few things that we've been talking about. We were talking about the subtle effects theory, the idea that the media is not particularly good at telling people what to think, but they're stunningly successful in telling their audiences what to think about. I'm also bringing in the agenda setting effect, right? The more coverage that the media gives to an issue, the more importance the public places on it. And again, it's not just the volume of coverage, but sometimes it can be the placement of coverage. When I was talking about local news and how they started to increase the amount of coverage of crime, they didn't just show more crime stories, they put them on first. They were at the very beginning of the broadcast, all of which gives the impression that this must be an important issue. So let's look at the coverage of crime. So on the picture you can see here, there's a head on the left and a head on the right. The person on the left is a liberal. The person on the right is a conservative. At the very top of the image is the news, my little microphone image that I like so much. And blaring out of the microphone is crime, 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 crime. Okay, so keeping that in mind, let's think about the memory-based model and how this works. So we're talking about the memory-based model, we're talking about the agenda setting effect, and we're talking about the subtle effects theory all combined. Well, if the media is covering crime, 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 what's going to be at the top of people's heads? Well, if you look at the picture right now, what you'll see is that both the liberals and the conservative, the liberals on the left, the conservatives on the right, now, when it comes to which issue they think is the most important issue of the day, both of them have the same sort of composition of attitudes. The liberal has 4 attitudes focused on crime at the top of his head, 7 attitudes at the back of his head, and the conservative has the same thing. Now, in a way, you might be asking yourself, well, Phil, this is exactly what people say. The media is totally shaping what people are thinking. They're all thinking about crime. Doesn't that speak to the power of the media? Well, in a way, yes, but in a way, no. And here's why. When liberals think about crime, how they believe it should be addressed is different than what conservatives think about how crime should be addressed. So in the upper left-hand corner, I've listed a couple of basic ideas that liberals often propose for dealing with crime. For example, liberals would say that crime is really a symptom of a bigger societal problem, so there needs to be more investment in communities where the crime rate is high. Give people more options and they won't choose a life of crime. Liberals would also say, let's end the war on drugs. There are too many people who wind up in prison for minor drug offenses, and once they have something on their record, it's very easy for them to get sucked into a life of crime, because then it becomes harder to get jobs, it gets harder for them to get housing. A bunch of other things can happen if you wind up in jail as a result of a crime conviction. They also say that there should be more money spent on programs for youth. Give them an option for what they can do rather than hanging out with gangs. And so I've listed the investment in communities as L1, liberal 1 solution, ending the war on drugs as L2, programs for use as L3. So while the liberal had crime at the top of his head, in terms of thinking about solutions, that's what's in the top of the heads and the back ahead of the liberals. They have 2 L1s, they have 2 L2s, 2 L3s, and they have 1 of each in the back of the head. In other words, yes, the liberal is thinking about crime, right? But what they think about crime and what should be done about crime is related to their ideology. Now let's look at the person on the right, the conservative. For conservatives, the solution for dealing with increases in crime and high levels of crime are longer sentences, reducing the opportunity for parole, putting more police out on the street. And so I've identified these as C1, the longer sentences, C2, less parole, and C3, more police. Well, if you look at the top of the head and back of the head of the conservative, they don't have any liberal ideas in the top or back of their head. They have conservative ideas in the top and back of their head. So they have two C1s, the longer sentences, two C2s, two C3s at the top of their head, and then one of each in the back of their head. And this is what we mean by the media is particularly good. The media may not particularly good at telling people what to think, because this liberal thinks very differently than this conservative, but they're very successful in telling their audiences what to think about. People will have crime at the top of their head. And so it's important to understand that the impact that the media is having there in this image where it shows crime at the top of the head and the back of the head of both the liberal and the conservative, they're shaping what they're thinking about, but they're not shaping what they're thinking. The liberal is thinking in terms of liberal solutions. The conservative is thinking in terms of conservative solutions. The power of the media is limited. Now, in this case, we have somebody who's presumably univalent, the liberal, and univalent, the conservative. The ambivalent might be a more complicated story, but I want you to understand the general idea that the media is shaping what people are thinking about, but not necessarily what they're thinking.